Okay, gonna back up for this one. Hi, it's Misha, and we're continuing on with cat wings. And in this episode, we have Grumman's E2. Specifically on the table, this is an E2C Hawkeye. So, okay, it's not a cat-named plane, but it is Navy, and it is Grumman. And we have a 1/72 scale model from Hobby Master. And while this is not exactly an attack plane or combat plane, and if you couldn't guess, not exactly a fighter, it is very, very critical to the U.S. Navy's combat operations, and has been so for 70 years. So historically, it's very important. So I couldn't help but include it in this series, even if its name doesn't quite fit. Well, with that in mind, today's episode is sponsored by Hobo, our old, reliable cat that kind of keeps an eye on everything that goes on in the house. She's not very aggressive or violent, but she sure keeps an eye on things and kind of tells everyone else what to do. Hobo sneeze. I think she wants to return to sleep. Alright, now on to the not cat-named plane. This all dates back to the 1950s. The original plane, later known as the E1 Tracer, was a modification of the S2, but the Navy needed a purpose-built AWACS, basically a radar plane, and put out requirements in 1956. And the following year, the Grumman design was selected for further refinement and adoption. And it was initially designated as the W2F-1. The F in these names is kind of the Navy code for the Grumman factory. And the first prototype flew in October of 1960. Now this wasn't a full prototype, it was just an airframe test. But a fully equipped prototype would fly very soon the next year, early 1961. And so this would be ready for adoption. Of course, in 1962, McNamara insisted all the branches kind of unify a naming convention, and this became the E2 Hawkeye. And it first went into Navy service as the E2A in January of 1964, and very promptly fell on its face. Originally, the E2 was designed with the constraint that it had to operate on board the older Essex-class carriers, which dated back to World War II. So even though this was given folding wings, it still had a lot of constraints as far as size. To that end, the electronics, the radar, the computers, the avionics, so on and so forth, had to be crammed into a pretty small space, and this led to overheating and other issues. So much so that the project was actually canceled after 59 2As had been built in 1965, but enough money and time had been devoted that Grumman quickly, along with working with the Navy, introduced the E2B which more or less rectified most of the problems. They went to a new radar. They went away from more of an analog computer system to digital. They updated the avionics. They just refined things and gave, of course, better cooling. And the E2B actually was pretty successful. It really was made from converting 49 out of the 59 E2As, and then was first used in Vietnam in 1965 and would continue to be used through the war. So this, like I said, is the E2C. This dates all the way back to 1968. The E2B was a kind of a stopgap measure, a band-aid solution, but they knew they could do better. And of course, in the 1960s, computers and all of that were rapidly advancing. So that project began, and it first had a test flight, the E2C, in 1971, and then was ready to go in 72 and was put into service initially in 1973. And the E2C again had an updated radar, a more modern flight system, computers, so on and so forth. So that gets us to this plane. Like I said, it had folding wings, which is good, because it's a big plane. We're nearly 58 feet long. We have a wingspan of over 80 feet when deployed. Now this is a turboprop. It's not a jet. With one engine on each wing. It's not a speed demon. It can only get up a little past 400 miles per hour, but it really likes to cruise at more like 300 miles per hour. And it had a maximum ceiling of about 34,000 feet. But that's okay because its primary mission didn't need speed. It was more needed for loitering. And it did that quite well. We have a crew of 5. We have 2 in the cockpit, a pilot and co-pilot, and then in the back, kind of in the middle of the fuselage, we have a radar officer, and we have essentially an air traffic control officer, and we have a combat systems officer, and these 3 guys will sit in the compartment below the dish and monitor all these systems. Keep in mind, when this was made, while digital computers were becoming more and more the norm, there was still a lot of manual inputting, and this plane did a lot of roles. It was an early warning system. It also was a command and control system. It could relay radio messages air to air from plane to plane, or air to the ship, air to surface. It could coordinate defensive missions like combat air patrols, basically getting all the planes to work together. It could also coordinate for strike missions, offensive. And it could even be used in an emergency as an air traffic control plane when what service wasn't available from the ground. It could do a lot of things, and therefore, even though it never launched a missile or gun, was never fired directly by it, it helped planes do that and coordinate and make sure different targets were assigned and just really give early warning to the fleet and so on and so forth. So, very critical plane. So it's really good that after a rocky start by the 70s, this was a pretty reliable system. And of course, they would continue to update the radar and computer and other electronics all throughout its life. So every few years they would keep doing that. Well, the 2C really wasn't in service long enough to be used much in Vietnam, but it was afterwards. And also, the F-14 Tomcat was coming online around the same time as this plane, and the two were a really good match. The F-14 will rely on the E-2 for coordination and support, and the E-2 would direct the F-14s to intercept fighters or whatever was needed. Most carriers would have 4 to 5 of these on board. The goal was to have one in the air, or at least the ability to have one in the air at all times, so a 24-hour eyes in the sky. These were often called the electronic eyes of the fleet. And they would keep them up loitering and patrolling. They would often, as I said earlier, coordinate the combat air patrol. In fact, they did so during Operation El Dorado Canyon in 1986, and they were used again very extensively in 1991 during the first Gulf War. They were also used to help support the U.S. Navy officers on detachment working with and for the Coast Guard, as well as U.S. Customs and law enforcement during drug interdiction missions in the 80s and early 90s. They were even used to mount search and rescue missions, help find downed aviators or even civilian craft lost at sea. Heck, they were even used to give support to rescue operations after Hurricane Katrina. So, not just a military plane, they had civilian applications as well. Well, in 2004, new propellers were introduced. You see on this one, we have 4-bladed props. 2004, they would introduce 8-bladed props. These are easier to maintain. They also cut down on vibrations and interference with the electronics. And they're made of a new carbon fiber. Then in 2007, the E2D Advanced Hawkeye first had a test flight. And this, of course, would again have more modernized and updated avionics, electronics, and radar. It would have more modern digital stuff like a glass cockpit. They would even eventually link it to coordinate with cruise missiles. And they would work on aerial refueling, which would increase its loiter time, at least doubling it. Well, in 2010, the Navy would first try out the E2D and then receive its first planes. By 2013, it was put into full production. And by 2015, it was declared fully operational. 2016, they finally got the aerial refueling system up and running for the 2D, meaning that it could be on station as much as 6 hours, with the total flight time as much as 8 hours. And the E2C and E2D are very much in service and production to this very day. It's worth pointing out that Grumman merged with Northrop in 1994 to form Northrop Grumman, so later E2Cs and all of the E2Ds are actually Northrop Grumman, but the earlier A's, B's, and C's would be made under the Grumman name. This actual model from Hobbymaster is an example of an Israeli IDF Hawkeye. While most of these were used by the U.S. Navy, Israel and a few other nations would adopt them. And it's worth saying that even though this was a carrier-based plane, Israel operated it very successfully from land and found that because of not having constraints and a longer takeoff and everything, it actually was able to go into the air and stay up a little longer. Just a very iconic piece of U.S. Navy history. And again, it's still in service today. In fact, it's one of the longest, if not the longest serving and still in production Navy planes of all time. To date, anyway. Almost 70 years and counting. So despite the rocky start, it's been immensely successful. As far as this Hobbymaster model, it is heavy. The wings, the fuselage are solid metal. The dish can rotate. It's made out of plastic. Part of the tail is plastic, other part's metal. You don't get the full 5 crew members, because how would you really get them in the middle of the fuselage? So you just get the pilot and the co-pilot to sit in the front. The propellers, of course, rotate, and you can do landing gear up or down. And I almost had to do this down, because the one thing I will say about this plane, actually there's nothing against the plane, the stand it comes with is way too flimsy. It's just this plane has too much wobble because of the wings. They really should have gone to a metal stand or something different. I ended up having to just layer the stand together with glue to get it to hold, because the little cradle just it wore itself off essentially after a while. So even now I'm still not sure how much longer it'll hold off. I might need to try to look into maybe buying like a caliber wings stand, which can be configured, and using that. I think a style like that where it was more supported by the wings and tail would be better than just the fuselage. So that's my only gripe. The plane itself is pretty neat, and because it is 1/72 scale, it is impressively large. So there we have it, folks. Like I said, kind of maybe stretching a point a bit to consider this a cat wings plane, but hey, it's Navy and Grummings, so 2 out of 3, right? Any questions or comments, please do post them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and if you haven't, you might check out some of my other videos. Why not? And next we will get to the one probably most people have been waiting for. The plane straight out of the danger zone. This is Misha, and I'll see you very soon next time.